Hello, welcome to Crackenfold. Following on from my video on how Woden became Odin, we raised some thoughts about Loki. Now, understanding Loki is a challenge on many levels, with the main one being we don't have as much information directly about him as we would like. And so in this video I'm going to start looking into this and other places we can find information or infer information, and that is by talking about Loki's alternate persona, Utgardloki, and a way of using that to understand more this trickster character. The main source of this information comes from the Prose Edda, which is a book of stories and information on the Old Norse gods, written in Iceland in the 13th century by a Christian monk named Snorri Sturluson. But we must approach this source with caution, as we don't understand how much bias Snorri wrote into this book, as much as he was interested in maintaining a record of skaldic poetry, he was also interested in converting pagans into Christians. But equally, if Snorri wrote down exactly what he was told into the Prose Edda as per his sources, there would still be no pure version or original version, because when it comes to orally transmitted tales, and that's how the Old Norse told their stories, they vocalised them, they didn't write them down. These types of stories, those that are orally transmitted, change over time, whether that be a week, a month, a year or centuries, and they also change depending on where they're told, from Iceland to Norway to Sweden and perhaps even into Russia. So given all this information, we'll take a careful approach at stepping through what we do know about Utgardloki and the Prose Edda. So the other thing to know about Utgardloki, and related to Snorri being a Christian monk, is that we're pretty sure that a proportion of that myth is actually made up by Snorri himself as a tool to convert pagans. But we do know Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote the history of the Danes a fair few hundred years before that, actually has a very similar story. So we know they're both based on the same myth, an existing myth. We just don't know how much Snorri has altered the view and therefore diluted or biased what we know about Loki. And finally, in this video I'm going to talk about or touch on how Loki and Odin may be related to help our understanding there and to lay some groundwork for future videos. But in this video I'm going to say welcome to the story of Utgardaloki and welcome to Crackenfold. So let's start with the difference between Loki and Utgardloki. Now Loki's parentage is most often considered, but not always, most often considered part Jotun, part goddess. His father was Farbuti, an interesting name I'll look at in another video, a Jotun, and his mother, Lofi, was a goddess. And I'll also mention here that the Jotuns weren't giants. That's a common mistranslation. Jotun, it means a sort of hungry, monstrous being, a consuming being, and can be associated with dwarves, as it could be with trolls. They can be considered extremely ugly as well as extremely attractive. Now, Lofi's parentage, being a goddess, isn't recorded by Snorri, but it does list her down as a goddess, and that may indicate some weight as to why Loki was considered part of the Aesir, where normally it is a person's father's side that is considered his parental side, so he would normally be considered a Jotun. So that's an interesting switch there. So with that background information, sort of briefly into Loki, let's talk about Utgardaloki and who he was. Well, he was a Jotun as well, and he lived in a castle called Utgard. But in many stories over time and location, the name of the castle changes and the name of the Jotun changes. And it is these changes that will give us clues as to maybe some aspects of Loki that aren't plainly written. So I'm not going to go through the whole Utgardloki story here, that will take a whole video in itself. But what I will do is just pick out the pieces that allow us to infer more things about Loki. And the first thing is that this place is known all across Scandinavia and beyond. One particular tale has Thor visiting, that's in Harbarth's song, and there is evidence from Russia that there's a story called the Russian giant Svyatogor and the Norse Utgardloki is documented in folklore. I'll reference that down below in the description. So it's a well-known place, and it's considered otherworldly. In effect, journeys to it often had to happen by crossing the sea, and that itself acted as a portal in these journeys. And the journey you took from wherever you were to Utgard was often full of challenges. In Harbarth's song, Thor is also teased about his journey to Utgard, but the giant here isn't called utgarda-loki, he's called Fialarr, and that's interesting. So, as I say, the giant does change his names, and as I'm calling him a giant because that's how the myth refers to him rather than a Jotun. And in some myths, he's also called Skrymir. So this giant has many names, but the Fialarr name is particularly interesting as it allows us to look at an often skipped section of the Voluspa, which is the catalogue of dwarves. Now, the catalogue of dwarves lists lots of dwarves' names, and it lists them in a particular order with regards to their abilities. And Fialarr, whose name probably means fire, is such that we know this because he's next to the dwarf named Frosty. And Frosty sounds very much like frost, as it means cold. So we have cold and warm together, or frost and fire together. So we believe Fialarr, the giant's name here, has got something to do with fire. So also within the Voluspa is a rooster who cries at the start of Ragnarok. And because of that, we can infer his name will probably mean messenger of fire. And so we have a rooster of Fialarr, this dwarf of Fialarr, this giant of Fialarr. And so we must think of these as the same character. And that isn't undeniable because these things happen in Norse mythology. Characters can shape, change and have different personas. That's just how Norse mythology works. Now, given these different names to this character, we can also believe that Svyatogor, the giant mentioned in the story of the Mead of Poetry, who managed to keep hold of it with his daughter, was also the same giant at Utgardloki, the same person. As Saxo writes in the History of the Danes, he writes about Utgardlokus, a Latin equivalent of Utgardloki. He says that Loki is the keeper of divine wisdom. So he could be a keeper of the runes of wisdom or Hymir's cauldron. He possesses the things that are much desired by gods and men. This Loki, he describes, is covered in chains, but he's wearing them as clothes. He has them as restraints. His home is Utgard. He isn't exiled there. The snakes there are his servants. Here we now see that there's a difference between Snorri's Loki, an illusionist, a magician, and Saxo, who's almost comparing him to the devil. And perhaps Saxo knew more about Loki than Snorri. He was writing some hundreds of years before Snorri. And so if we tie all this information together, the names that link to fire, and we know that Loki's daughter was Hel and his son Fenrir was a hell dog, we can also ascertain things about his father's name, which I'll do in another video. We start picturing, or we start drawing a picture of who Loki really was. Potentially an anti-god who you had to visit to achieve a great deed or get a powerful weapon. Now, in summary, Utgard was a place in myth. You would have to make a sacrifice to a sky god who would tell you how to journey to it. You undertook a journey across the sea, which took you to another world, and there you would have to travel through dark forests and mountain passes, many challenges before encountering Utgardloki himself. And then you would ask him for a snippet of wisdom, or you try and retrieve a kidnapped daughter of a king, or get your magical weapon. But not all journeys here were successful. When you're at Utgard, visitors would find this Jotun, this giant, this form of Loki, a worthy opponent, even for an invincible god. And he is connected with fire and another world. Perhaps his myth starts with the same source as the devil from Persian myths. That wouldn't surprise me. He is ancient, he is known across the lands. And to also add to this about Utgard-loki, this Loki character also didn't want Odin to leave Hel when he went there. He wanted to trap Odin here. But we also have to bear in mind that some parts of this story by Snorri Sturluson, are almost certainly made up as a Christian conversion tool, or a pagan conversion tool to convert people into Christians. And so, we have to question what traits did Snorri know about Loki. There is one other thing I want to say about Loki and Odin, and that is that they were blood brothers. In Loki Sana, a poem in the Poetic Edda, stanza 9, and I'll give you a contemporary English version of this. Loki says to Odin, "Odin, do you remember when we blended our blood together?" And Odin did not retort or deny this. This means that Odin and Loki were blood brothers. And perhaps this also goes towards understanding why Loki was accepted into the Seer and was allowed to hang around the gods so much. In fact, with Loki residing at times in another world and being associated with Hel, he could be inferred to as a deity of death, albeit a rather passive one, unlike Odin, who actively went out getting people killed for his army of Ragnarok. Although Loki did kill Baldur, or pretty much, slightly indirectly, but he forced that to happen. But for now, I just wanted to lay a groundwork of who Loki could be by looking at one of the alternate figures in myth. He is an ancient character known throughout the northern European continent, and there's so much more I could tell you in terms of names he's connected to and things he has done. But for now, I'll leave that there for something to ponder. Ask questions away in the comment section down below, and I will make more Loki videos in the coming months to add to this, so we can build up a really good picture of who this character really was. Whether he was just a chaotic character, or whether he was an anti-god or a devil figure. We'll find out. Or we'll do our best to anyway. So until the next video, please stay safe and stay well. And this was Krakenford.